Imagine a battlefield, not with swords or guns, but with silence. Imagine a woman, sitting in a small, dim room, surrounded by pages of letters, her pen racing across paper as if time were running out. No one would remember her name, at least, not for 100 years. Yet the words she wrote would help reshape an empire. Or picture another scene, a woman walking through muddy streets, holding the hands of frightened children who had been abandoned during a war. There are no cameras. No awards. No grand statues built in her honor. But because of her, dozens, maybe hundreds, of lives would be saved. History often remembers names like Napoleon, Churchill, Lincoln. But what about the women behind the moments? The ones who were there, sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly, shaping the same world, facing the same dangers, asking the same big questions, and yet whose names never made it into our textbooks. This story is for them. For the women who changed history, not always with power, but with persistence. Not with armies, but with courage. The unsung heroines of the past. You might ask, why haven't we heard their stories more often? And why now? Because knowing these stories is more than an act of justice. It's an act of learning. These women faced prejudice, war, poverty, and sometimes even exile. But they kept going. Their lives weren't just brave, they were smart, strategic, and deeply human. And if you're learning English right now, or trying to understand history from different perspectives, these stories can offer something powerful, real language in real context. Real emotions. Real meaning. Because learning a language isn't just about grammar, it's about learning to think differently. And few things shift our thinking more than the stories we've never been told. So, let's explore this together, not just to remember these women, but to ask better questions. About history. About justice. About what it really means to leave a mark. In this journey, we'll uncover the forgotten chapters of world-changing movements, look at revolutions through women's eyes, and witness how compassion, science, protest, and art were used as tools of resistance. But before we begin, take a moment to reflect. Who taught you history? And how many women's names do you remember from those lessons? It's time to rediscover the past, and perhaps, to rewrite it. Let's start by asking something simple, but powerful. Why is it that the people who shape the world the most are often remembered the least? Why does this moment in history matter? Because right now, in the 21st century, we're still asking the same question. Who gets to be remembered? In school, we learn about kings and presidents, generals and inventors. But we often forget that history is not just made by the powerful, it's made by the persistent. And often, by people who had no official title, no resources, and no platform. That's why telling the stories of unsung women matters. Because when we expand who we remember, we expand how we understand progress, resistance, and even leadership. Let's consider a paradox. We say we value equality. We believe in fairness. And yet, if you open most history books, you'll find that fewer than 1 out of every 10 names mentioned is a woman. How is it possible that half the population could do so much, and yet be remembered so little? The answer, as always, lies in context. Throughout history, women have been at the heart of revolutions, science, civil rights, and education. But often, they operated outside the spotlight. Many weren't allowed to publish under their own names. Others were told their ideas were too radical, or worse, ignored entirely. Take the case of Ada Lovelace. In the 1800s, she wrote what many consider the first computer algorithm. But for decades, the credit went to the man she worked with, Charles Babbage. Ada's notes, rich with foresight and imagination, were seen as supportive rather than groundbreaking. Or consider the women of the American civil rights movement. Rosa Parks is remembered, but what about Ella Baker? She was a mentor to many younger activists, organized grassroots efforts, and pushed for democratic leadership. Yet her quiet, behind-the-scenes work often goes unnoticed in mainstream narratives. Even in science, think about Rosalind Franklin, whose X-ray photographs of DNA were critical to the discovery of its double helix structure. While Watson and Crick went on to win the Nobel Prize, Franklin's contribution was mentioned as a footnote, if at all. These stories show us something deeper. That recognition doesn't always follow reality. And that history, as we often learn it, is not a neutral list of facts. It's shaped by power, who had it, who wrote it, and who was left out. But here's the good news: we can change that. By looking back with more curiosity, more fairness, and more openness, we can bring these lost stories forward. And that changes how we see the world today. Because these women didn't just face personal challenges. They were fighting entire systems of sexism, racism, poverty, and censorship. And yet, they moved history forward. Sometimes inch by inch. Sometimes all at once. So when we ask, why does this matter? The answer is this. Because history is a mirror. And if we only see part of the picture, we misunderstand who we are, and who we can become. Now that we've framed the bigger question, let's step back and look at the landscape. What was happening in the world when these women were working behind the scenes? What were the social, political, and economic forces at play? To understand that, we need to walk into the heart of the 18th and 19th centuries, when revolutions were shaking empires, scientific discovery was accelerating, and voices were rising from the shadows. Let's begin in the late 1700s. Europe was burning with revolution. In France, citizens stormed the Bastille and overthrew the monarchy. In America, the colonies declared independence from British rule. These moments were loud, dramatic, and often violent, and they were driven, we're told, by great men with great ideas. But beneath the thunder of cannon fire and the roar of crowds, quieter voices were speaking too. One such voice belonged to Olympe de Gouges. A French playwright and political activist, she published a bold document in 1791 titled The Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen. It was a direct response to the French Revolution's famous Declaration of the Rights of Man, which had excluded women. Olympe wrote, "Woman is born free and lives equal to man in her rights." For this, she was ridiculed, imprisoned, and eventually executed by guillotine. In the same era, across the Atlantic, women were also demanding to be heard. Abigail Adams, wife of U.S. President John Adams, wrote him a now famous letter, "Remember the ladies," she urged as he helped draft the new American government. But her words were dismissed as playful. In reality, they were prophetic. These were not isolated incidents. Across continents, women were using their voices, pens, and networks to influence public discourse. But without voting rights, formal education, or legal independence in many places, their impact was often hidden in private letters, salons, and anonymous publications. Now let's fast forward to the 19th century, a time of industrial growth, colonization, and massive scientific advancement. Yet while factories grew and empires expanded, women still lived under tight restrictions in nearly every society. In Victorian England, for example, women could not own property if they were married. They were expected to be silent in public debates, their education limited to accomplishments like embroidery or piano playing. And yet, even in this restrictive world, women were pushing boundaries. Mary Seacole, a Jamaican British nurse, traveled to Crimea in the 1850s, at her own expense, to care for wounded soldiers during the war. She was turned away by the British War Office because of her race, but that didn't stop her. She built her own British hotel near the battlefield and provided comfort, medical care, and even food to the troops. Despite being celebrated by soldiers at the time, she was largely forgotten by history until the late 20th century. Meanwhile, in India, a woman named Savitribai Phule was opening the first school for girls in the 1840s, in a deeply caste-divided society. She and her husband were threatened, harassed, and even pelted with cow dung for challenging social norms. But she kept teaching, kept fighting. She became one of the first female teachers and social reformers in India, and yet, she rarely appears in global history books. These stories aren't just inspiring. They also reveal a pattern, women changing history not by holding power, but by challenging it, often quietly, often at great personal cost. So here's a question I'd like you to reflect on. If many of these women had lived today, with more rights, more visibility, more opportunity, how different would our world be? Or, to ask it another way, what innovations or ideas have we lost in history simply because the people who had them were never allowed to speak? Think about that. Because the cost of erasing someone's story isn't just historical, it's human. And the more we look, the more we realize how many brilliant voices were muted by time, prejudice, and power. Now let's go deeper. In the next part, we'll shift focus from individual figures to the hidden forces that worked both against and through them, underground networks, informal institutions, and movements that, despite being ignored by official records, played a vital role in shaping change. While the public stage of history often belonged to kings, lawmakers, and generals, real change also emerged in less visible places, kitchens, back rooms, secret networks, and small gatherings where women shared knowledge, spread ideas, and offered each other strength. Let's begin with a group history nearly forgot, the women of the abolitionist movement in the 1800s. While the fight to end slavery is often told through the voices of male figures like Frederick Douglass or William Wilberforce, it was women, both black and white, who organized many of the earliest campaigns. They held reading groups, published pamphlets, and hosted traveling lecturers. Take Sojourner Truth. Born into slavery in New York, she escaped and became a powerful speaker against slavery and for women's rights. Her famous 1851 speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" cut straight to the core of both racism and sexism. She was illiterate, but her voice moved crowds and shook hearts. And yet, even today, her legacy is less known than it should be. Or think of the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah, who were born into a wealthy slaveholding family in South Carolina. They rejected their privilege and spoke out publicly against slavery and for women's rights. This was dangerous, even illegal in their time. But their letters, speeches, and refusal to stay silent became sparks that helped light a movement. These efforts didn't happen in isolation. Women built informal but powerful networks, in sewing circles, churches, and community meetings. Without access to parliaments or pulpits, they used the tools they had. Some even ran underground schools to educate girls and the poor. Others smuggled information, money, or supplies to resistance fighters. One especially overlooked example comes from Eastern Europe. During World War II, Irena Sendler, a Polish social worker, helped rescue over 2,500 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto. Disguised as a nurse, she smuggled babies out in toolboxes and older children through secret tunnels. She kept detailed lists of their real names buried in jars, hoping one day to reunite families. She was arrested, tortured, and narrowly escaped execution. For decades, few outside Poland knew her name. Why do these stories matter? Because they reveal the hidden engines of historical change, systems of quiet resistance and support that worked in the background. And because they challenge our definition of what makes someone important. We often associate importance with titles, fame, or public recognition. But what if true importance is measured by impact, especially impact made without reward or recognition? That brings us to a wider question. Have we focused too much on leaders in history and not enough on the people who sustained the movements behind them? The story of women in history isn't just a list of individual heroines, it's a story of collaboration, of persistence in the face of being ignored, erased, or punished. It's about women who held communities together during war, who passed down banned knowledge, who nursed the sick during pandemics, or who quietly defied laws that denied them agency. And it's about how even today, many of those contributions remain unnamed. What would it mean to build a history curriculum that didn't just add a few notable women to the margins, but actually centered the experiences of women as essential to how change happens? As we move forward, let's explore the emotional and cultural impact these women had, not only on the politics of their time but on the psychology of the societies they lived in. How did the public react to them? Were they celebrated or rejected? How did their presence shape public imagination, and what does that say about how we see leadership and value? Let's take a deeper look at the human side of history, the emotions, traumas, joys, and lasting cultural shifts brought about by women who weren't supposed to matter, but absolutely did. History isn't just a list of events, it's the story of how people felt, feared, hoped, and changed. And when we look at the emotional landscape of the societies touched by these women, we begin to understand the true depth of their impact. Let's revisit World War II, a time when global conflict shattered millions of lives. While men were drafted into armies, women stepped into roles society had long denied them. In Britain, the Women's Land Army kept farms running. In America, Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of industrial power, a woman in overalls, hair tied up, operating machines once reserved for men. This shift wasn't just practical. It was psychological. Women were no longer seen only as mothers or homemakers. They were workers, thinkers, and decision-makers. And this changed how many women saw themselves, and how societies began to define gender roles. But what happened after the war ended? Many of these women were expected to quietly return to the kitchen, to give their jobs back to returning soldiers, to pretend those years of empowerment hadn't happened. For some, this return was painful. It felt like erasure. The pride they had felt was now uncomfortable, even taboo. And yet, the seed had been planted. Those wartime experiences became memories, and those memories became fuel for the feminist movements of the 1960s and 70s. The slogan, "The personal is political," was not born in theory but rooted in the lived contradiction of being needed and then dismissed. In other parts of the world, women's influence unfolded differently. In India, the independence movement was deeply shaped by women like Sarojini Naidu and Kasturba Gandhi, who inspired thousands through nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience. They were often arrested, beaten, or humiliated, yet their quiet determination moved entire villages and communities. After independence, however, many of these women were sidelined in the official telling of history. Statues went up for the men. National holidays bore their names. But the women? They were often remembered simply as supporters or wives. Even in today's culture, how we remember female figures reveals something about society's deeper values. Are they remembered for their intellect, courage, and impact, or only for their relationships to powerful men? Think about public reactions to powerful women today. Do people admire them as leaders in their own right, or question their confidence, appearance, or tone? In psychology, there's a concept called implicit bias, the unconscious attitudes we carry. Even now, many societies associate leadership with male traits, deep voices, assertiveness, decisiveness. When a woman speaks strongly, she may be called aggressive. When she shows emotion, she may be labeled too sensitive. This bias isn't always intentional. But it's real, and it has deep historical roots. And yet, history also offers counterexamples. Take Wangari Maathai, the Kenyan environmentalist who founded the Green Belt movement, empowering women through tree planting. Despite opposition, arrests, and threats, she transformed both ecological awareness and gender empowerment in Africa, and won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004. Her movement not only changed landscapes, it changed minds. Or Malala Yousafzai, who survived a Taliban assassination attempt at age 15 for demanding education for girls. Her courage sparked a global movement. But in many ways, she represents countless young women who stood up, were silenced, and often never heard of again. So, let's pause and reflect. Why do some women become symbols while others, equally brave, are forgotten? Is it about media, timing, geography, or something deeper in how we define greatness? As English learners and global citizens, you have a unique opportunity. Language isn't just about grammar or vocabulary, it's about understanding how narratives are built, and who gets to be at the center of them. By exploring these hidden stories, you're not only improving your language skills, you're learning to question, to see, to imagine a more complete picture of humanity. Let's now look at how these forgotten voices continue to shape the world we live in, not just through politics or war, but through culture, laws, and daily life. Because history, after all, isn't over. It's still being written, and each of us is part of the pen. History teaches us patterns, but it also leaves us with questions. And one of the most powerful questions is, what can we learn from these stories today? In our modern world, many societies have made great strides in gender equality. Women lead nations, run global companies, and influence culture in ways our ancestors could barely imagine. And yet, the gap between recognition and reality remains. Women's contributions are still often underpaid, undercredited, or misunderstood, especially in fields like science, politics, and even storytelling. Think of the tech world. We often hear names like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk. But how many people know about Ada Lovelace, the 19th century mathematician who is now recognized as the first computer programmer? Or Grace Hopper, the American computer scientist who developed the first compiler for a programming language and helped make modern software possible? Their legacies are only now becoming more widely known, but how many more women, across the globe, remain invisible in similar ways? It's important to ask, who gets to write history? And who decides which stories are important? These are not just questions for historians, they're questions for all of us. When we study history, especially in English, we're not just gaining facts. We're gaining the ability to think critically about how those facts are framed, presented, and remembered. We're also learning how to ask better questions, like, what stories are missing? Whose voices are left out? This is a powerful way to connect language learning with ethical learning. And when it comes to change, real, lasting change, we need more than headlines. We need emotional understanding. That's what these unsung heroines offer us. Their stories show us what courage looks like when no one is watching. What resistance looks like when it brings no reward. What leadership looks like when it's done quietly, day by day. Today, as the world faces new challenges, climate change, digital inequality, war, and displacement, the voices of women, especially from marginalized communities, are more vital than ever. Consider the story of Nadia Murad, a Yazidi woman who survived genocide, escaped captivity, and went on to become a human rights advocate and Nobel Peace Prize winner. Her story is not just about survival. It's about turning trauma into action and silence into voice. Or the teenage girls leading climate strikes around the world. Or women journalists in war zones risking their lives to tell the truth. These are not just stories of personal bravery, they are stories of collective memory and responsibility. So what can we do, as learners of English and as people who care about the world? We can start by paying attention, really paying attention, to the voices around us. In books, on podcasts, in classrooms, on YouTube. Who are we listening to? Who are we learning from? We can ask ourselves, what kind of world are we building with our attention? With our language? With our stories? And maybe most importantly, we can reflect on the women in our own lives, mothers, teachers, neighbors, friends, whose impact may never make it into textbooks, but whose courage and care shape our futures every day. Language, after all, is not just about communication, it's about connection. And every time we learn a new word, or understand a historical figure more deeply, we widen our capacity to connect. So here's a challenge for you. Think of a woman, past or present, who has shaped your thinking or your life. Can you describe her story, in English, in a way that honors her voice? If you feel moved, share it in the comments. Let's create a space where forgotten stories can be remembered, where ordinary women are recognized for their extraordinary strength. Because the past is not just behind us. It's inside us. And what we learn from it can shape who we choose to become. Now, let's turn to language. After all this history, what expressions and vocabulary can we take with us into our own English journey? Let's take a moment to slow down and reflect on the language you've just heard. Whether you're here to improve your English or deepen your understanding of the world, or both, this section is for you. We'll explore 10 key words and expressions from today's story. These aren't random vocabulary words. They were carefully chosen because they are useful, meaningful, and deeply connected to real-life topics, especially social issues, history, and personal reflection. 1. Unsung heroine. Meaning, a woman who has made an important contribution but has not received recognition. Example, Rosalind Franklin was an unsung heroine of DNA research. Use it when you want to highlight someone whose work deserves more attention. 2. Rewrite history. Meaning, to change the way a historical event or person is remembered, often to reflect a new understanding or agenda. Example, recent research helps us rewrite history to include women's roles in ancient societies. Use it when you talk about changing perspectives on the past. 3. To stand the test of time. meaning to remain important, relevant, or strong even after many years. Example, her impact stood the test of time, even though she was never formally honored. Use it when talking about lasting value or legacy. 4. Speak out. Meaning, to express an opinion publicly, especially against injustice or wrongdoing. Example, she spoke out against colonial violence, risking her freedom. Use it when describing activism or moral courage. 5. Turn the tide. Meaning, to cause a significant shift or reversal in a situation. Example, women in factories helped turn the tide during World War II. Use it when explaining key turning points. 6. Behind the scenes. Meaning, out of public view, where important but often unnoticed work happens. Example, women were organizing behind the scenes while the revolution unfolded. Use it when you want to talk about invisible labor or quiet leadership. 7. Marginalized. Meaning, treated as insignificant or pushed to the edges of society. Example, many of these women came from marginalized communities. Use it when discussing inequality or power imbalance. 8. Legacy. Meaning, the lasting impact of a person's life, work, or values. Example, her legacy lives on in the rights we enjoy today. Use it when reflecting on history, mentors, or influence. 9. Day by day. Meaning, gradually, with steady effort, even when results are not immediate. Example, she changed her community not with speeches, but day by day. Use it when talking about perseverance or daily acts of leadership. 10. Voice, as in to give voice to. Meaning, to express, represent, or empower someone's story or opinion. Example, this documentary gives voice to women who were never interviewed. Use it when discussing storytelling, media, or representation. Now here's something for you to try. Choose 2 of these expressions and write a short paragraph in English. Maybe you'll write about someone you admire. Maybe a lesson from history. Or maybe even your own experience. And here's a speaking challenge. Can you describe a woman from your country's history using at least 3 of these expressions? Try it. Record yourself. You might be surprised how powerful your voice sounds when you use rich, thoughtful language. Remember, learning vocabulary is not just about memorizing words. It's about expanding your ability to think, feel, and connect in English. Next, let's finish our journey with a closing reflection. What do we carry forward from these stories of forgotten heroines? So, what do we do with all of this? We've walked through centuries, across continents, and into the lives of women whose names never made it into our school books. Women who healed, resisted, led, taught, and built, not for fame, but because they saw what needed to be done. These are not just women of the past. Their struggles echo in our present. Their voices whisper through our own questions. What does it mean to make a difference? Who gets remembered, and who gets erased? As we've seen, history isn't just a list of kings and wars. It's also the quiet persistence of a nurse in a war zone, the pen of a poet in exile, the courage of a student speaking up in a classroom where her opinion is dismissed. These are the stories that shape our humanity, and they deserve to be told. Maybe you've even thought of someone from your own country while listening. A grandmother who raised a family through hard times. A teacher who believed in you when others didn't. A local leader, a neighbor, a friend. Here's something to consider. If you could add one woman to your country's history textbooks, someone who isn't famous, but should be, who would it be, and why? I'd love to hear your answers in the comments. Because this isn't just about learning English or learning history. It's about learning how to see the world, and each other, more clearly. Let's keep this conversation going. And if this video made you pause, reflect, or even feel inspired, I hope you'll give it a like, share it with a friend, or leave a comment below. Every bit of support helps us keep telling these stories, stories that often go untold. Next time, we'll explore a moment in time when ideology, fear, and courage split a city in two, the rise and fall of the Berlin Wall. But we won't just ask how it fell, we'll ask what it meant to live in a world that was divided. Until then, thank you for being part of this journey. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep remembering. Learning English is learning how the world came to be, and who helped build it. See you in the next story.